"Don't move, cowboy," the Apache women warned, but the lonely rancher still tried to save them. The sun rose slowly over the dry hills, turning the pale sky from gray to soft orange. Morning in the open land always came quietly. No wagons, no church bells, no voices. Only wind moving through dry grass and the creaking of old fence posts that had stood longer than most men could remember. Thomas Callahan woke before the light reached his window. He always did. Years of ranch life had trained his body to rise early, even when there was no real reason anymore. The cattle herd had grown small. The pasture had grown thinner, but habits stayed long after hope faded. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The cabin felt larger than it was because it was empty. One table, two chairs, a cast iron stove, and a shelf with a few plates. The other side of the room held things he never moved: a folded blanket, a tin cup, and a wooden box. They belonged to someone who would never come back. Thomas stood, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The air was cool but dry. It smelled of dust and sun-warmed stone even before the heat arrived. His ranch sat far from the nearest town, a full half-day ride if a horse was strong and the rider didn't stop. When he first settled there, other ranches dotted the valley. Smoke used to rise from 3 chimneys across the flats. Now only his remained. The railroad had changed everything. It passed miles south, and trade followed it. Water wells closer to the tracks meant better land, easier cattle shipping, and neighbors close enough to help each other during storms. One by one, the other ranchers packed their wagons and left. They told Thomas to come with them. He never did. Some thought he stayed because he was stubborn. Others thought he was simply slow to accept change. The truth was quieter than either. He had already lost the one person who made any place a home. Leaving the land would not change that. Staying did not fix it, but staying felt easier. He began his morning chores. The well rope groaned as he pulled water. He filled the trough, checked the small group of cattle grazing near the low ridge, and mended a broken fence rail loosened by wind. He spoke aloud only once, to a mule that ignored him. By mid-morning, the heat started rising from the ground in gentle waves. The horizon shimmered. The sky turned a hard blue that never promised rain. Thomas saddled his horse, Ranger. The animal was old but reliable, much like the ranch itself. He carried a small canteen and rode out to inspect the far fence line near the dry wash. Coyotes sometimes slipped through there, and though he had few cattle left, he guarded them carefully. They were the last proof that his life still had purpose. The ride took nearly an hour. The land rolled into shallow dips and rocky patches dotted with mesquite trees. The silence pressed on a man out there, not frightening, just heavy. A person could hear his own thoughts too clearly. He dismounted near the wash, kneeling to examine hoof prints hardened in the dirt. Most were old. A few belonged to mustangs, nothing unusual. He straightened and wiped his hands on his trousers, then paused. Something felt different. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of a normal sound. Birds that usually scattered when he rode close were missing. Even the wind seemed to move around a certain patch of brush instead of through it. Thomas rested his hand lightly on the saddle horn and stared toward a thick cluster of mesquite below the slope. At first he saw nothing, just tangled branches and dry shadow. Then the shadow blinked, his eyes narrowed. Slowly, shapes formed where he thought empty ground had been. A dark braid, a small shoulder, another figure behind it. He did not reach for his rifle. Years in the territory had taught him one thing: sudden movement brought trouble faster than anything else. He remained still, studying carefully. There were 5 of them, 3 women and 2 children. They were crouched low, pressed close to the earth, as if trying to become part of it. Their clothes were dusty, and their posture showed exhaustion more than fear. One child leaned against another, barely holding upright. Thomas felt surprise more than alarm. Travelers did not come this far off the main trails, not families, not without supplies. He shifted his weight slightly to get a clearer view. Immediately, the nearest woman lifted her head sharply. Her eyes locked onto his. For a brief moment, neither moved. The distance between them was no more than 30 yards, but it felt wider than the valley itself. The woman's expression was not hostile. It was urgent. She raised one hand, palm outward. Thomas remained motionless. Her voice came soft, strained, and careful, shaped by effort rather than fluency. "Don't move, cowboy." The words hung in the air between them, carried by the warm breeze. He frowned slightly. The warning confused him. If they feared him, they would run. If they threatened him, they would shout. But this sounded like concern. The other two women glanced repeatedly past him toward the open valley beyond his back. Thomas listened. At first only wind touched his ears. Then faint and far came a different rhythm, a distant vibration carried through the ground more than the air. Not thunder, too steady, too patterned, hooves. He turned his head only with his eyes, not his shoulders. The sound was still miles away, but approaching along the natural path that cut through the valley. Riders would pass close enough to see any movement in the wash. He understood then why the woman had spoken. She wasn't warning her people about him. She was warning him about others. He slowly lowered his hand from the saddle horn, keeping his body relaxed. The horse sensed the stillness and stood quietly. Even the animal seemed to feel the tension settling over the land. The child nearest the woman swayed, and she gently steadied him without breaking eye contact with Thomas. Her look carried a clear message. Any sudden action would draw attention from the approaching riders. The sound of hooves grew clearer, mixed with faint metal rattling. Thomas stared at the horizon line ahead of him and kept perfectly still, exactly as she had asked. The sun climbed higher, and the moment stretched long enough for him to hear his own heartbeat. For the first time in years, his solitude was broken, not by neighbors, not by friends, but by strangers depending on his stillness. And without speaking another word, he obeyed. The sound came closer little by little. At first it was only a faint shaking in the ground, but now Thomas could clearly hear separate hoofbeats. More than one horse, maybe 4, maybe 6. The wind carried the noise unevenly, making it hard to count, but one thing was certain: they were riding fast and straight through the valley. Thomas kept his eyes forward, exactly as the woman had warned him. Every part of his body wanted to turn his head and look behind him, but he didn't. Out here, small movements could travel far. A shifting shoulder, a turning hat, even a nervous horse could draw attention. His horse flicked an ear. Thomas gently rested his hand against the animal's neck to keep it calm. The woman in the brush did not move either. Her hand was still raised slightly, though now it looked less like a command and more like a quiet request. The children pressed low into the dust beside her. One of them looked barely strong enough to stay upright. Their lips were dry and their faces were pale under the sun. The hoofbeats grew louder. Soon voices followed. Men were talking, relaxed, careless voices that belonged to riders who felt safe and confident. Thomas knew that tone well. Men sounded like that when they rode in groups and believed they controlled the land around them. A few seconds later, the riders appeared over the low rise behind him. 5 men. They wore wide hats and carried rifles across their saddles. Not soldiers, no uniforms, but local riders who had gathered together for patrol. That kind of group had become common in recent years. Rumors traveled fast across scattered towns, and fear traveled even faster. When cattle went missing or tracks appeared near ranches, riders went searching whether they had real proof or not. One of the men raised a hand. "Mornin', Callahan." Thomas slowly turned his head now as if he had only just noticed them. He nodded once, calm and ordinary. "Mornin'." The horses walked closer, hooves crunching the dry ground. Dust rose around them and drifted toward the wash, toward the hidden figures. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest but kept his face blank. One rider leaned forward on his saddle horn. "You been out long?" "Checking fence," Thomas answered simply. Another rider wiped sweat from his brow and glanced across the valley. "We're tracking sign. Heard about cattle gone missing near the northern flats." Thomas shrugged lightly. "Plenty of wild mustangs roaming lately." "They break lines easy." The men looked past him, scanning the land. One of them studied the wash, the very place where the women and children hid. Thomas felt time slow. If they rode 10 steps closer, they would see them. The lead rider nudged his horse forward 2 paces. "Mind if we water the horses at your well later?" Thomas kept his voice even. "Water's low, but enough for a few." The rider nodded but kept staring across the ground behind Thomas. "You seen anyone pass through? Any strangers?" The question hung heavy in the air. Thomas did not answer right away. Not too fast, that would seem nervous. Not too slow, that would seem dishonest. He shook his head. "No one." One of the riders circled slightly, his horse stepping sideways. The movement lined his view almost directly toward the brush. The woman's warning echoed in Thomas's mind. Don't move. So he didn't. He rested his arm across the saddle horn, relaxed, as if nothing in the world required attention. Even his breathing slowed. The horse beneath him stood steady, feeling his calm. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then a distant bird cried somewhere across the hills. The rider glanced toward the sound instead, losing interest in the brush. Another man laughed lightly. Tracks probably lead west, saw dust that way earlier. The leader looked once more around the valley, then turned his horse. All right, we'll check the ridge first. Relief nearly escaped Thomas, but he held it back. The riders began moving off. Hoofbeats shifted away, fading step by step. Their voices drifted behind them until the wind swallowed the sound again. Silence returned. Thomas did not turn immediately. He waited. Out here echoes could trick a man. Riders sometimes doubled back. Only after nearly a full minute passed did he slowly face the wash. The woman lowered her hand. For the first time, her shoulders relaxed slightly. The children lifted their heads. One of them coughed weakly. Now that the danger had passed, Thomas could see them clearly. They looked exhausted, not just tired from walking, but worn from days without rest. Their clothing was coated in dust. One woman supported another who struggled to remain kneeling. Thomas dismounted carefully and took a few slow steps forward, keeping his hands visible so they knew he meant no harm. Up close, he noticed the smallest child's lips were cracked from thirst. He removed his canteen and set it on a flat rock halfway between them. Then he stepped back. No words were needed. The eldest woman waited a moment, studying him to be sure the riders were truly gone. Then she moved forward and picked up the canteen. She gave the children small sips first before taking one herself. They drank slowly, carefully, the way people do when they know water is precious. Thomas spoke quietly. "They gone." She nodded once. Her English was limited but clear enough. "Many riders, many days." She pointed toward the distant hills, then toward the ground, tracing a slow path with her finger. Traveling, hiding, Thomas understood. They weren't wandering. They were avoiding roads, wells, and open land, the very places riders searched first. The smallest child tried to stand but stumbled. The woman caught him quickly. Even after water, he lacked strength. Thomas looked toward the sun climbing higher. By afternoon, the heat would become harsh. Staying in the open wash would be dangerous. He hesitated. Helping strangers in this territory was never simple. Too many misunderstandings had already happened between people who did not share language or trust. And the riders who had just left would not look kindly on anyone assisting those they searched for. But leaving them here felt worse. The child leaned against the woman again, barely awake. Thomas sighed softly. He walked back to his horse, untied a small cloth bundle from the saddle, and placed it beside the rock, dried meat, and a little more water wrapped inside. Then he stepped back again, giving them space. The woman looked at the bundle, then at him. Her expression held both caution and gratitude. The wind moved gently through the grass around them. No riders, no voices, only quiet land once more. For the second time that morning, Thomas found himself part of something he never expected. Not a rancher guarding cattle, not a man alone on empty land, but a stranger standing between fear and survival. And though no promise had been spoken, a silent understanding now existed between them. The sun was already high when Thomas looked again at the small group in the wash. The little food he had left with them was nearly gone. The children tried to eat slowly, but hunger made them hurry. Even after drinking, their hands still trembled. The heat would grow harsh before long. Thomas knew the valley well. By midday, the ground itself would burn through thin shoes, and the air would dry a person's throat within minutes. There was no safe shade in the open except under his own barn roof miles away. He rubbed his jaw, thinking. Helping them even this much had already crossed a line most men in the territory would never step over. The riders he spoke to were not cruel men, but fear made people suspicious. If they returned and found signs he had hidden strangers, they would ask questions he could not easily answer. He glanced toward the distant hills where the riders had disappeared. Dust still floated faintly along the horizon. He should leave now. That would be the safest choice. Instead, he walked back toward them. He stopped a few steps away so they would not feel crowded. The eldest woman rose slowly to face him. Up close he could see how tired she truly was, not just from walking, from days of watching, waiting, listening for danger. He pointed toward the open land, then toward the sun overhead, then shook his head. Too hot. Next he pointed toward himself and then in the direction of his ranch. Her eyes followed his gesture. She understood quickly, but she did not answer right away. She looked back at the other two women, then at the children. They exchanged quiet words in a low voice. Finally she spoke, choosing each English word carefully. "Far, some," Thomas said, "but safe." The smallest child tried to stand again and nearly fell. That decided it. The woman nodded once. Thomas exhaled slowly. The decision was now real. He walked to his horse and untied a spare rope. From his saddle, he removed a folded blanket and laid it across the mule he had brought for hauling fence posts earlier that morning. He adjusted it into a seat. The children watched with tired curiosity. He motioned gently. "Ride." At first they hesitated, unsure if it was meant for them. The eldest woman guided the weakest child forward. Thomas helped him climb carefully onto the mule. The second child followed behind him, holding tightly to the blanket. The other women would walk. They seemed used to long distances, though their steps were slow. Thomas mounted his own horse and began leading them along a narrow path that wound between low ridges instead of crossing open ground. He chose routes cattle rarely used, shallow gullies, and dry creek beds where tracks would not be easily seen. They traveled mostly in silence. Every so often Thomas paused and listened. The land carried sound far. Riders could be heard long before seen. Twice he stopped them completely and waited until distant echoes faded. Each time the women understood immediately and kept still without being told. Hours passed. The sun burned down, but the mule's slow, steady pace allowed the children to rest. One of them leaned forward, half asleep, gripping the rope loosely. Near afternoon, they reached a stretch of scattered rocks that marked halfway home. Thomas allowed a short stop in the shade. He gave them small amounts of water, not too much at once, knowing sudden drinking could make sickness worse after long thirst. The eldest woman watched how carefully he measured it. She nodded in quiet approval. "Name?" she asked softly, pointing to him. "Thomas," he replied. She tapped her own chest. "Atza." The others spoke their names too, though the words were unfamiliar to him. He repeated them as best he could, earning faint smiles from the children. After resting, they continued. By the time the sun began lowering toward evening, the outline of his ranch finally appeared. A small cabin, leaning corral fence, and a narrow barn standing alone in the wide land. No smoke rose from the chimney. No visitors waited. Thomas rode ahead to check the area before guiding them in. Old habit. He circled once, scanning the horizon. Nothing moved except wind through grass. He waved them forward. The women stepped into the yard cautiously, studying everything, the well, the trough, the empty corral. The children slid from the mule, their legs shaky but relieved to stand on still ground. Thomas led them behind the barn to the hay shed, a simple structure open on one side but shaded and hidden from the main trail by a ridge of earth. He spread extra blankets on the ground. "You stay," he said gently. "No fire, smoke seen far." They understood. He filled a bucket with water from the well and placed it inside the shed. Then he brought dried meat and a little flour from his supplies. Not much, but enough for a few days if rationed carefully. The children ate quietly. The women did not rush their food this time. Evening cooled the air. Crickets began their steady song. For the first time since morning, the group allowed themselves to relax. One woman leaned back against the wooden post and closed her eyes. Thomas stood outside the shed, unsure what more to do. This place had been silent for years. Now soft voices and small movements filled it again. The sound felt strange, not unwelcome, just unfamiliar. Atza stepped beside him. She looked toward the darkening horizon, then back at him. "Tomorrow?" she asked. Thomas understood her question. They could not stay long. Riders traveled often, and even friendly neighbors might talk without meaning harm. "Rest tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we see." She nodded. Night settled over the ranch. Stars appeared one by one across the wide sky. Thomas returned to his cabin but left the door slightly open so he could hear if trouble came. He sat at the table without lighting the lamp. For years he had lived with only wind and cattle sounds. Now he listened to quiet breathing from the shed outside. He knew the risk he had taken. If anyone discovered them here, explanations would not matter. Yet as he stared into the darkness, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. The sense that his choices mattered to someone other than himself. Outside, the land remained still. And for the first time in many seasons, the lonely ranch was no longer empty. Morning came quietly over the ranch. Thomas stepped outside just as the first light spread across the hills. For a moment he stood still, listening. The same soft sounds reached him, wind across the grass, a loose board tapping against the shed, and faint movement from inside where his guests were waking. He walked to the well and began pulling water. The rope creaked in its familiar rhythm. Usually that sound echoed alone across the yard, but today it felt different, like the ranch itself knew others were here. Atsa stepped out from the shed, careful and alert, though she had slept for the first time without fear in many days. She nodded to him in greeting. Behind her, the children remained wrapped in blankets, still resting. Thomas handed her a tin cup. She drank slowly, then filled another for the others. The smallest child smiled weakly after the first sip. It was a small thing, but it stayed in Thomas's mind. They could not remain long. Travelers sometimes crossed distant trails, and smoke or footprints could bring questions. Even friendly visitors could talk later without realizing the trouble it might cause. The longer the group stayed, the greater the chance someone would notice signs. Thomas sat at the wooden step outside his cabin and drew lines in the dirt with a stick. Hills, dry creeks, old wagon routes he remembered from years ago. When Atsa approached, he pointed carefully as he spoke. "Many riders here," he said, marking the main trail. "Not safe." Then he traced a longer path winding through rough land toward the mountains far away. "Water here, here, here." Each mark represented a spring or shaded rock pocket only someone living there a long time would know. Atsa watched closely. She memorized each point, repeating the directions quietly to herself. The other women came to listen as well. The children sat nearby, following the conversation even without understanding every word. After a while, she looked at him and asked, "You go." The question lingered. Thomas had planned only to give directions. Guiding them meant leaving his ranch unattended and risking being seen traveling with them. But he also knew the first days would be the hardest. The paths twisted through open stretches where mistakes could lead straight into riders' routes. He stared at the lines he had drawn. The land seemed simple on paper, but he knew how easy it was to get lost among similar hills. Finally, he nodded once. "Part way." Relief showed in her eyes. They prepared quickly. Thomas packed small portions of food into cloth bundles and filled every container with water. He saddled Ranger and loaded the mule again. The children climbed up with less struggle today, though they still tired easily. Before leaving, Thomas looked around his yard. The place returned to its usual silence, yet something had changed. He locked the cabin door, a habit he rarely bothered with, and led the group toward the western ridges. They traveled through uneven ground where cactus and stone replaced grass. The route curved between low hills that blocked distant views, making them harder to spot from far away. The sun rose higher, but a thin breeze kept the heat manageable. They spoke little, saving energy. When they needed to stop, they chose shaded places and rested only briefly. Thomas checked the ground often for fresh tracks. Near midday, he suddenly raised his hand. Everyone froze. From beyond the next ridge came a faint clatter, not loud, but clear enough to recognize as riders moving across hard ground. Thomas quickly guided them off the path into a shallow dip surrounded by brush. They crouched low. The children remembered his stillness from the day before and did not move. Even the mule stood quiet, trained by years beside cattle. The riders passed somewhere above them. Voices drifted down the slope, carried by the wind, then faded again. No one spoke until the sound disappeared completely. Thomas exhaled slowly. Atsa gave a small nod of thanks. The moment passed, but it reminded them all how careful they must remain. They continued westward. By late afternoon, the land began to change. The ground rose into rougher foothills, dotted with larger rocks and scattered trees. In the distance, faint columns of smoke lifted into the sky, thin and steady. Atsa saw them and stopped walking. Her face softened with recognition. She pointed toward the smoke, speaking quickly to the others. The children perked up, suddenly alert despite their fatigue. Thomas understood. They were close to people they trusted. Still, he led them carefully along the last stretch, avoiding open ground until they reached a sheltered slope overlooking the valley below. From their small figures could be seen moving near the smoke, too far to distinguish but clearly a camp. They had arrived. The group paused. No celebration, just a quiet moment of relief. Atsa stepped forward and touched the mule gently, helping the children down. The smallest one stood on unsteady legs but managed a grateful smile toward Thomas. She reached into a small pouch at her side and removed a narrow beaded cord, worn but carefully kept. She held it out to him. "Friend," she said simply. Thomas hesitated, then accepted it. The beads were smooth from years of handling, each one placed with care. He did not know its full meaning, but he understood it was important. No long goodbyes followed. The women turned toward the distant camp, guiding the children down the slope. After a few steps, Atsa looked back once and raised her hand, not in warning this time, but in farewell. Thomas raised his own in return. He watched until they disappeared among the rocks. The valley fell silent again. He stood there a long moment before turning Ranger toward home. The journey back would be lonely once more, yet the land somehow felt less empty than before. The ride back felt longer than the ride out. Thomas moved slowly across the familiar hills, guiding Ranger along the same hidden paths he had taken earlier. The sun lowered behind him, stretching his shadow across the dry ground. Now there were no quiet footsteps behind him, no mule, no soft voices, only the steady sound of his horse and the whisper of wind. He expected to feel relief. The danger was over. The responsibility was no longer his, but the silence felt heavier than before. When his ranch finally came into view, the place looked exactly as it always had: small cabin, leaning fence, empty yard. Nothing showed that people had rested there just the night before. No smoke, no extra tracks except those already fading in the dust. He unsaddled Ranger and let the horse drink. Then he sat on the step outside his door, holding the beaded cord in his hand. The tiny beads caught the last light of evening. Each one was shaped slightly differently, made by patient hands long ago. He turned it over between his fingers. He didn't know their customs or all their words, but he understood gratitude when he saw it. That small object carried more meaning than anything he owned. Days passed. Thomas returned to his normal routine, checking fences, watching cattle, repairing tools. Yet his attention often drifted to the distant foothills where he had left them. Sometimes at night he thought he heard faint echoes of children laughing, though he knew it was only memory filling empty air. A week later, riders appeared again. 3 men approached his ranch at midday, dust rising behind them. Thomas recognized one of them from before, the same man who had asked if strangers had passed through the valley. Thomas stepped outside calmly as they dismounted. "Afternoon," the rider said, scanning the yard. "We're still tracking movement through this area." Thomas nodded. "Haven't seen much." The men walked slowly around the corral, studying the ground. One crouched near old hoof prints, though wind had already softened most marks. "You been anywhere west lately?" another asked. Thomas shook his head once. "Fence repairs kept me close." The rider looked toward the hills for a long moment, then sighed. "Probably nothing. Trails go cold quick out here." After a short pause, they mounted again. One tipped his hat politely before they rode off. Thomas watched until they disappeared. Only then did he breathe fully again. Weeks turned into months. Summer heat faded into cooler evenings. The grass grew thin but survived. Life returned to its steady pattern, yet something unusual began to happen. His cattle stopped wandering. Before, he often found them scattered or restless, sometimes startled at night by distant movement. Now they remained calm. Fences stayed undisturbed. Even when storms rolled through, the herd gathered close instead of bolting. Thomas noticed it but said nothing. Ranchers sometimes spoke of luck as if it were weather, arriving without reason and leaving the same way. One evening, while repairing a gate, he spotted movement far off near the ridge, too distant to see clearly. For a moment he thought it might be wild horses. Then the figure raised a hand briefly before disappearing behind stone. He did not chase or call out. He simply stood there a long while before returning to his work. Years passed quietly. More ranches appeared closer to the railroad, but none settled near his land. People still wondered why he stayed in a place others had left behind. He never offered an explanation. Inside his cabin, one change remained permanent. The beaded cord hung beside his bed. Each night before sleep, he placed it carefully on the small wooden box near the wall. Each morning, he put it back around a nail where he could see it. Not for protection exactly, but as a reminder that even in the loneliest place, choices mattered. Time aged him gently. His steps slowed, his hair turned pale, and his herd grew smaller as years demanded less work from him. Neighbors who rarely visited said he lived an uneventful life. Quiet man, quiet land. They were not wrong. Yet they never knew that once, long ago, strangers had trusted him with their lives, and he had trusted them in return. On his final winter, a cold wind swept across the valley. Thomas spent most days inside, the stove warming the small room. One morning he did not rise early as usual. A neighbor who came days later found the cabin peaceful, nothing disturbed. The chair beside the table, the cooled stove, and beside the bed, the beaded cord resting where his hand could reach it. The story spread through nearby towns in simple words. The old rancher had lived alone and passed quietly. Most remembered him only as a man who kept to himself. But far beyond the valley, among people who traveled the old mountain paths, another memory remained of a silent rider who listened instead of fearing, who stayed still when warned, and who helped without asking for reward. The land kept both memories. And the wind crossing the empty ranch carried them together, long after his footsteps were gone.